This video explains how Helios is rendering over other applications and demonstrates it by building a small heads-up profile. Okay, here we're going to start clean. I'm going to open my main monitor. Actually, I put a button here to make to explain something, but then we're going to delete it. Like we showed in the previous videos, you select something that becomes your current object of interest. It shows their bindings and everything, but also it shows over here the properties for that button and how is it laid out and how does it click and things like that. When you, instead of clicking one of your controls, if you just click the background, you're actually selecting the monitor itself that you're working on. So these properties then are the properties of the monitor. Just two of them. One is always on top, which means that Helios will, for if there's any content on this monitor being rendered by Helios, it will render it over the top of other applications, and it will force itself to be an overlay, even if the focus is on some other application. So, for example, you can have Helios controls rendered on the screen over the top of your game, but your keyboard and mouse focus is still on the game. It's kind of a critical thing, obviously, for Helios to work right. If you turn that off, then Helios will act like a normal application on that screen and it will end up behind your game. Then fill will fill in the background of that screen with a solid color or an image, and that is something that you got to be careful with, because if you do that on a screen where you actually were mixing Helios content with, let's say, external viewports of DCS or some other screen from another game or another third-party software, you won't be able to see those because Helios will be over the top of it and blotting them out. So if you expect to be able to see through the Helios controls onto whatever's application underneath, then you can't fill that screen. Of course, if that screen is a little tiny screen you have over to the side just for Helios, then fine, you can fill it in. There's nothing behind it. But again, some people think, for example, that DCS external viewports are part of Helios, but they're actually drawn by DCS. So you can't be covering those up. And so if you set this, then you wouldn't be able to see the DCS viewports anymore. Common mistake. Anyways, so let's use that for something cool. Sometimes, in the real world, I assume if you're a real pilot, you have, it's like second nature to you to keep like half an eye on the airspeed dial, or, basically keep an eye on things. And but in simulator, we have like a narrow field of view, and the controls can be too small, or maybe people don't have perfect vision. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a heads-up airspeed control for people who are visually challenged or fly an F-14. We're not going to actually use F-14. This is half tongue-in-cheek. It might also be useful. So we're not actually going to use an F-14 gauge because we don't have any here in the box, and I don't feel like cutting the one out of a Captain Zine profile right now. So we're going to take an F-16 gauge, which should just drive all your purist friends crazy, and that's also good fun. So here it is. So here's an airspeed control. It's already pre-built for us. Comes with Helios. We're just going to use it. It has two inputs we're going to need. We need to set the indicated airspeed, and we need to set the Mach number. Now we need to get those somewhere. Let's save first. Okay, saved already. Okay. So we need to get those somewhere, and what we're going to do is we're going to use DCS because that's what I know and have, and we're going to use the Flaming Cliffs interface. Now, the Flaming Cliffs interface is not like a cockpit interface; it's like more like a interface to the actual simulation itself. So it gives us like the real numbers, not what would have been displayed in the cockpit, even if the cockpit of a particular plane, had some distortion in it or something in the instruments. It just basically gives us raw simulator data. And as far as I know, it works for every DCS vehicle or aircraft. Correct me in the comments if actually one of the developers managed to make it not work. But we're going to use that interface for two reasons. Number one, it's very simple. And number two is if you were to use a profile like this and then go and play on like a hardcore dogfighting server, then it would the interface would just stop working, because on those servers, the server administrator can set an option to not allow exporting of the raw simulator data, like ownership exports, and they would typically turn that off, which means this interface will stop working, which means you won't gain an unfair advantage by your, heads up airspeed display. We don't want to be cheaters or anything. We're just trying to, maybe make the simulation more accessible to somebody. If you're in a casual place where this policy is not set, then yeah, it'll work. Okay, great. So let's add an interface. We're going to need the Flaming Cliffs interface to get the data, and here it is. We're going to tell it where our DCS installation is. I guess I should have shown you that, but I'm just going to go through this step again. There are other videos on all this stuff, but I just wanted to say that yes, you would have had to do that. Here's my main DCS installation for testing. Great. We're going to configure it to not even send anything other than basic telemetry. So basic telemetry is just like sort of the basic stuff, and you'll see that in the interface. In Flaming Cliffs, it's like basic telemetry is just this simulator telemetry, just these basic values that we can always get for every aircraft, because we want this to work for as many different airplanes as possible. So that's why I'm setting it up like that. I've already written the export file. If I didn't, then the button over here would say set up DCS, and I would click that. Okay, so now we have an interface that has the data we want. Now we're going to do exactly what we did in all the examples. I'm going to click the thing we want to configure. We want to configure its inputs. Then we're going to find the source of the information, which in this case is the simulator telemetry page in the Flaming Cliffs 3 interface. We're going to say, okay, indicated airspeed changes. We're going to set the indicated airspeed on the dial. If the Mach changes, we're going to set the Mach. So Mach here is a number in M. It's Mach on the other side. Hopefully that'll be the same number. And then on this binding, we're getting the data in meters per second, and the gauge expects knots, but because Helios is smart and it knows how to convert things, it'll just convert it for us, because it knows that it's meters per second and it has to go to knots. Great. Okay, so we have it set up. We have it hooked up. This should, in theory, work. Let's try it. Don't laugh at me if it fails. Okay, so I called this one heads up 1. Run it. There's the dial. I'm going to need DCS. I have too many windows open. I'm already in an F14 because I wanted to not make you wait. And we unpause. Oh, there we go. So now we have, the interesting airspeed indicator that the F14 actually has. But if we're like, zoomed up like this, or maybe our view is like more or something, we still have our little trusty on-screen, up in the corner, zoom view on that dial. Okay, so why does this work? Well, it works because, see, I'm clicking around here in DCS, even though Helios is over the top. Usually, if that was a normal application, Helios would now be grabbing my, oh, good flying, Amo. Would now be grabbing my, input focus, and we obviously don't want that. Yeah, I'm flying with keyboard here because my development machine, so give me a break. Also, I don't know the F14 at all. But yeah, so that is like the simplest profile we can build. We don't even need a second screen. We don't have a touch screen. We didn't do any of that fancy stuff. We didn't download a profile. We just threw a dial on the screen and hooked it up. Pretty cool. All right. I think so anyway. All right. So let's do one thing that is just a tiny bit more advanced. Remember I told you that it did the conversion for us on the binding? I'm going to do something now where it doesn't do the conversion so that we can show like how things can get technical, but why they do. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pretend that I have like a fancy new helmet that always shows my airspeed, helmet mounted. Basically, I'm just going to paste it on the screen, right? So if I'm looking around with track IR, it's just going to stay right there in the middle. Well, that doesn't look right. So let's put it in the center. Let's make it like a nice big font. Ding. That seems good. Nah. More. Yeah. Okay. And no background, so it'll be transparent. And it's going to sit up there. And now this one, so it's a text display. It's just like a text display. It's just a Helios control that just shows something that is live, you know, that is being data that is being sent to it by a binding. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up the indicated airspeed changed event. I'm going to send it to the text display. Now see, we get a bunch of warnings here. It says value cannot be empty. It you know, the input is a string. This is all not right. We're going to try to use the trigger value. It says, okay, we want to set the change the trigger value, which is the new airspeed, and assign it to the text display. It's not going to work because it says cannot convert trigger value to action value. It can't figure out what the conversion is because it's got meters per second on one side and it's got a string of text on the other side, and it doesn't know how to do that. It intentionally doesn't know how to do that because when you do this type of thing, that's usually not what you meant to do, so it just doesn't let you. What you have to do instead is, we could probably add another value here to this list that says just make it work, but again, usually it's not what you want. So what we're going to do is we're going to convert it. I'm going to just type a little piece of Lua code here. Yes, I know, I'm like coding right in the middle of this thing, but it's just a tiny little piece of code that is a snippet that you can easily copy. So we're just going to take the trigger value and we're going to make it a string. It's not going to work right. If you're playing along at home, you know why, but we'll go test it. Okay, so still running. I'm going to run it now. Again, it's a new version. Unpause. Okay, so that's meters per second, and obviously our dial is in knots, so that is not what we want, right? What we want to see up here is like a nice big number telling us how many knots we're doing. So at that point, we're just in code land, and we just need to do a conversion from meters per second to knots, which I'm going to ask my expert. How many knots is 1 meter per second?
The answer is 1.94 knots.
Siri says 1.94. So it's going to be 1.94 times trigger value. Okay, so that is now going to be knots, and we're converting it to a string, and we're returning it to Helios. And now it's going to be almost good, right? But I also want to not actually show the decimals because that's annoying because it keeps getting bigger and smaller. So the math floor function, blah, blah, blah. So now we've gotten, like, we've written this quote unquote code to solve this problem. Okay, run the new version, go to the game, unpause, bitchin', right? So now it's as if we have this thing taped to our head. Like if we look around, you know, it sticks with us because it's actually just on the screen. But it's like an incredibly cheap way of pretending you have a helmet mounted display. Again, it would be considered an unfair advantage, I think, by some people to do something like that. I don't want to talk to you. Go away, Jester. Yeah, but the point is that on any server where ownership exports are disabled, meaning you can't just like tac view yourself, this just doesn't work anyway, and I think that's the result that we want. So for a casual, or as you might say, filthy casual like myself, who's really just trying to learn how to fly this thing, this can be pretty helpful because with my eyesight, this is a pretty good model right here. Thanks for your time.